morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Rommeser, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time and talk about the E-2 visa, and more specifically about the E-2 visa options, where the E-2 investment amount is on the lower side and the E-2 cases that are considered to be risky. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. So some of you may know that the firm Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa himself and has been on several different visas, including the F1, TN, and H-1B visa. And as such, we know what you are going through during this process. The firm is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including the E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, green cards, and extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk. So this means when the investment amount is on the lower side. And we have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are the US consulate in Toronto and the US consulate in London. We'll continue to have this webinar series, and we will do at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you out some useful tools. So we'll be sending the PowerPoint we'll be using today during the presentation. We'll also send you a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail. We'll also send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars we'll have in the future. And this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. We will also send you a link where you can access the webinar on our YouTube channel. And we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we often post new immigration videos on different immigration topics. We'll also send you a link where you can sign up and schedule a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys. So today we are lucky to have Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who is a partner at Scott Legal PC, and Kelly has a vast experience processing E-2 visas at many consulates around the world. Finally, for any question you have, please add the question to the chat box or to the Q&A box, and we'll get to all questions at the end of the presentation. So finally, without further delay, let us get started. So what are the E-2 visa requirements? So the first requirement to qualify for an E-2 visa is that you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty country. So there are over 80 E-2 visa treaty countries around the world. So there are countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, Middle East, North America that are on the list of the E-2 visa treaty countries. So if you are a national of one of these countries, you could qualify for an E-2 visa. What matters here is the country of your nationality. So as long as you have a passport, of one of these countries, you could qualify for an E-2 visa, and it's not required that you were born in that country. So let's say, for example, that you were born in China. That's, China is unfortunately not an E-2 visa treaty country, but let's say that later you acquired a citizenship of one of the E-2 visa treaty countries, such as, for example, the UK, Canada, or Italy. As long as you have a passport of the E-2 visa treaty country, you could qualify for an E-2 visa. The second requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. So for an E-2 visa, there must be an entity set up in the US, and that can be for example, like an LLC, corporation, and you must own at least 50% in that company. And this is the requirement you have to meet kind of, like at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, but you always have to keep your ownership at least 50%. So like, let's say that at the time you applied for an E-2 visa, you owned 100%, but then the ownership dropped to 50%, that's fine, but it cannot drop below 50% because then, you would no longer be meeting the E-2 visa requirements. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the US. And what this means is that the funds you are investing must be at risk. And so this means that the money must be actually spent at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa. The money cannot just be sitting on your bank account. So let's say that you are starting a new business in the US. At the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, all the money has to already be spent. So like you would have to show that you leased an office space, you purchased all the equipment, you paid for marketing, you set up a website. So all the investment already has to be made. In case you are purchasing a business in the US, then the purchase price would already have to be transferred to the seller. There is an option to structure, like when you are purchasing an already existing business, you can either transfer the money directly to the seller, or there is an option to transfer the money to an escrow agent, and then the escrow agent would hold the money. And then when there is a final decision made on the E-2 visa application and the E-2 visa is approved, the money would be transferred to the seller. In case the visa is not approved, then the money would be transferred back to you. For the escrow, it's important to keep in mind that kind of like all the contingencies to the transaction would have to be already satisfied, and the only contingency left is the approval of the E-2 visa. But really, the important thing to keep in mind is that the investment has to be made before your E-2 visa is approved, and it's not sufficient that the money is just kind of sitting on your bank account. So like, let's say that you transfer $100,000 from your personal bank account to the company's bank account, and then the money is sitting there, you have it available, and you want to apply for an E-2, that would not be sufficient, because the consulate and the government, they want to see that the money was already spent at the time you apply. For the investment, you would have to show and kind of describe what is the source of the funds you are investing. So really, the funds can come from any legitimate source. The government just wants to see that the money is not coming from any kind of criminal, illegal activity. So the money, some common source of funds would be, for example, personal savings from your employment, sale of a property in your home country. And the money can also come from a gift or a loan from your friends or family. If it's a loan, it can also be an institutional loan from an institution. For a gift, you would have to present a gift letter from the person who is gifting you the funds. And then you would also have to submit documents kind of showing, like where the person who is gifting you the funds, like how they obtained the funds. So let's say that, a family member is gifting you the funds, and the funds are coming from that person's savings from employment. Then you would have to submit 3 most recent tax returns of the person. So it's just important to keep in mind that if the money is coming from a gift, gift letter alone would not be sufficient. You would also have to submit evidence kind of explaining where, how the person who is gifting you the funds, how they obtain the funds. For loans, so loans are fine. The loan can come from, again, like friends, family member, those are fine, or it can come from an institution. One caveat for loans is that the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So the loan can be unsecured, that's fine. The loan can also be secured by, let's say your personal assets or your real estate property, that's fine. But it cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So how much is enough? What investment do you have to make? So we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail on one of the next slides. And what are some typical E-2 visa expenditures? So in case you are purchasing a business in the US, then the investment would be the kind of the purchase price you pay for that business. In case you are starting your own business in the US, a new business, then some typical E-2 expenditures would be, for example, if you need to purchase an inventory, that would be part of the investment, kind of like any equipment you need to get the business started. So, like computer equipment, printing equipment, like anything like that. Then any money you pay for like website setup, marketing, that could be included as part of the investment. Any office supplies, like office furniture. Then any money you pay for office or warehouse rent could be included. And also any money you kind of pay for the business entity setup could be included as part of the E-2 investment. And also kind of legal fees you pay for either the business entity setup or also the immigration legal fees. So the next requirement for the E-2 is that the business cannot be marginal. So what does this mean? So the marginality means that the E-2 business has to have either present or future capacity to be able to earn enough revenue to support more than just kind of you as the E-2 investor and your family in the US. And really this means that the E-2 business will have kind of capacity and will be able to hire US employees. So we generally recommend that, the plan is to have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. And this is kind of minimum. If you have more, kind of the more you have or you will have, the better. So the plan should be to have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. Sometimes people ask, are 1099 contractors kind of sufficient? So if you operate in kind of a business where hiring 1099 contractors is kind of standard to the industry, like let's say that your company is a construction company and you'll be hiring a lot of contractors, that may be fine. But we always, even in that case, we always recommend that you do have some W-2 employees, like for example, like a secretary, office manager, or at least some employees as W-2 employees. The next requirement is that the E-2 business must be a real and operating business. So if you, if let's say you purchase a business in the US and the business is already operating, then you would be submitting things like the company's, tax returns, profit and loss statement, payroll, and W-2s showing basically that, the business already operating, earning revenue, and has employees. In case you are starting a new business in the US and you plan to start operations of the business after you come to the US, then you would be submitting things like the office lease of the evidence that you sign an office lease, for the company, evidence that the business entity has been set up, evidence that the business already has a website, basically showing that, like everything is already set up, the business is ready to kind of start taking revenue. And, really after the E-2 visa is approved, you will come to the US and start the operations. If you are able to get things like contracts with clients, that's going to be extremely helpful. Also, if you're not able to get contracts, but you would be able to get letters of intent from potential clients, like that will be helpful evidence to meet this requirement. And you also, like if you need any licenses to operate this type of business in the particular state, you would be submitting those as evidence, again, that, the business already acquired the licenses, the business is ready to start operations, and really the only thing missing is you coming to the US and starting the operations. The next requirement is that you are coming to the US to solely develop and direct the E-2 business. So really what this means is that, you as the E-2 investor have to have kind of like an active role in the E2 company. So generally, the E2 investor will be kind of like a CEO, COO, or like a manager of the company, performing kind of like a high level executive duties. And as we mentioned, you have to own at least 50% in the E2 business at all times, like at the time you're applying and also after the E2 visa is granted. You also, because the E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa, it's not a green card. It doesn't kind of allow you to stay in the US, kind of indefinitely. You will have to show that you have intent to return to your home country when your E2 visa is expired. Generally, the only evidence the government wants to see for this requirement is like a signed declaration by the E2 investor that basically says that, like once the E2 visa expires, you plan to return to your home country. But the standard, to meet this requirement is definitely kind of like lower than when you would be applying, for example, for a B visa, because for a B visa, you generally have to show things like you have a job in your home country, you own property in your home country, you have like bank accounts and things like that in your home country. For E2 visa, that's really, the government generally doesn't want to see that type of evidence, and really what is generally sufficient is that signed declaration saying that, you have intent to return to your home country. And as we said, there are two kind of options, like how you can get an E2 visa. So you can either start your own company in the US, or you can purchase a business. And then if you are purchasing a business in the US, you can either just sign a purchase-sale agreement and transfer the money, to the seller, or the transaction can kind of go through an escrow agent. But if it does go through an escrow, then all the contingencies, as we said, have to be met. And kind of like the only outstanding contingency is the approval of the E2 visa. Perfect. So how long is the E2 visa valid for? So this is going to depend on your country of nationality. So nationals of different countries can get the E2 visa granted for kind of different periods of time. And this is called a reciprocity period. So nationals of some countries can only get the visa granted for 3 months. And then, like nationals of other countries can get the visa approved for up to 5 years. So, you would kind of have to check the reciprocity schedule for your particular country. Many countries or nationals of many countries can get the visa approved for up to 4 or 5 years. So, for example, nationals of Canada, UK, Italy can get the visa approved for up to 5 years. And, this would mean that the E2 visa in your passport would be issued for a period up to 5 years. And then during the 5-year period, you can kind of travel in and out of the US. Now, let's say that the reciprocity period for your country is on the lower side. So let's say that you can only get the E2 visa approved for 3 months, or like, let's say for 1 year. What this would mean is that the visa in your passport would be approved for a period of 3 months, for example. But even in that case, every time you enter the US on an E2 visa, you will be granted a period of stay of 2 years. So let's say that you have the E2 visa approved for 3 months, and you enter the US during the validity of that visa. So during the 3-month period, when you enter the US, your I-94 should be granted for a period up to 2 years. So you should always, double check the I-94 to make sure that it was granted for the 2-year period. But if it is, that would allow you to stay in the US for the period of 2 years. Now, let's say that you enter on the 3-month visa, and then you have the I-94 approved for 2 years. If you leave the US and the 3-month visa is already expired, then you would have to go back to the consulate and get a new visa. But let's say that, you just entered the US and you just want to stay in the US for that period of 2 years, that's completely fine. And you can stay in the US for the 2-year period. Now, let's say that you are, for example, a national of Canada and you get the E-2 visa approved for a period of 5 years. It's going to be the same. So, every time you enter the US on the E-2 visa, you will never be granted an I-94 for 5 years or up to the expiration of the visa. The I-94 is always going to be granted for a period of up to 2 years. And this would mean that basically before the 2-year period on your I-94 is up, you would just have to leave the US. And as long as your visa is valid, you can kind of re-enter using the same visa. Now, officers may sometimes limit the duration of the visa based on the strength of the case. So like, let's say that you are a national of the UK and generally, you could get the E-2 visa approved for a period of 5 years. The officer could grant it for kind of shorter period. Usually it happens, like for example, when you are starting a new business and the officer is just kind of not sure that, the business will be kind of able to hire you as employees and will be kind of able to generate enough revenue. In that case, the officer could limit the visa approval period for, let's say, for like 1 year or 2 years, and then you would have to renew it, before that time. But I would say in our experience, it's not that common, but sometimes it may happen. So how much investment is enough? And this is so-called substantiality requirement. So there is no kind of like minimum set amount in the E-2 regulations kind of defining, like how much money you have to invest. It's kind of going to depend, like on several things. So our general recommendation is that, the investment, and this is the amount spent, should generally be kind of greater than 50,000. So the general recommendation is that you should spend at least 50,000 and then have some additional funds on the E-2 company's bank account as working capital. And the 50,000 amount, like that would be considered kind of like a low investment amount. There are some consulates where this amount, they are kind of like fine with this amount, but then there are other consulates that, would consider this amount to be just kind of too low. So it is going to kind of depend on which, which consulate you are applying or whether you are applying with USCIS or applying for a visa at a consulate. So as we said, the money has to be spent. So it's not just sufficient that you kind of transfer the funds on the E-2 company's account and say, like once I get the E-2 visa, I plan to make all these expenditures. That's not going to be sufficient. The funds have to be at risk, and the government wants to see that the investment has been made before they give you the E-2 visa. And so the kind of how large the investment should be is going to depend on the type of your business. So, let's say that you are, for example, starting a kind of service-based or consulting business, then, the investment can generally be kind of like on the lower side. Now, like let's say that you are starting a restaurant where you have to kind of, like rent a space, buy furniture, like buy equipment, like in that case, the investment is, like naturally will kind of like have to be higher. So kind of, how large the investment should be is going to depend on kind of like the type of business you are starting. And so what the government kind of uses to assess whether the investment is substantial when you are starting a new business is so-called proportionality test. So they basically look at kind of how much money you invested in the business versus what are the usual costs associated with establishing that type of business. And then they kind of compare the amounts, and if those are kind of, like same or very similar, then they would conclude that the investment is substantial. And usually, especially like in cases where the investment is on the lower side, they want to see that you invested like 100% or close to 100% that is necessary to start that particular business. Sometimes it's helpful to submit like business articles you can find online that talk about, like what are the usual kind of the standard costs necessary to start this type of business. It may be helpful to include those in the application to make an argument that, like your investment is substantial. And sometimes in cases like where the investment amount is kind of like really low, it may be helpful to submit kind of like a letter from CPA, certified public accountant, that would just kind of, the accountant would look at the expenditures you made and look at the business. And then in the letter, they would conclude that, the investment is substantial to start this type of business. In case you are purchasing a business, the proportionality test would basically be, the government would look at the purchase price of the business, and then they would look at the fair market value of the business. And again, like if they are kind of, same or kind of very close, then they would conclude that the investment is substantial. So what are some strategies to deal with a low investment amount? So if your investment amount is kind of on the lower side, then you would have to want to make the other kind of parts of the application really strong. So like let's say, or some things that could be helpful are, for example, if you are a very kind of like experienced businessman, you operated kind of similar type of business in your home country for several years, and the business is very successful, like that could definitely be helpful for a case. Or even if you kind of operated different businesses, but you have kind of like experience with managing kind of company, that could be helpful for your case. Another thing could be if you kind of hire employees before you get the E-2 visa. So like let's say that you are starting a new business in the US, the investment is on the lower side, but you already hired like an operations manager and some other employee, so like let's say that you already have 1 or 2 employees in the US, that could definitely be helpful. And you should then submit kind of the payroll and then the employment agreements with your application to show to the consulate that, you already hired employees. And then also the type of business is going to matter. So like, let's say that, like you are starting, for example, a restaurant, like then it's going to be clear to the consulate that you will have to, you cannot just kind of operate the restaurant by yourself. And it's clear that you will have to kind of hire employees in the future. So that is, like that is going to be helpful. As we said, like if you are able to kind of obtain contracts or letters of intent from potential clients, that would be helpful for your application. Sometimes it's helpful to include a letter from your kind of local chamber of commerce. Like usually you would just kind of reach out to your local chamber of commerce, and the letter would just kind of, like usually what the letter says is that, like they are kind of, like they think that this type of business is going to be kind of like really beneficial, like in this community, and they are supporting this type of business. So sometimes that may be helpful. If the company already, let's say that you are starting a new business in the US and the company already started operating and is already kind of earning revenue, you would definitely want to kind of highlight that in the application. And you should submit things like the profit and loss statement of the company, showing that the company is already earning revenue. You could also submit kind of bank statements of the company showing kind of incoming payments from clients and things like that. Another thing that could be helpful would be a strong business plan. So this is a case, especially if you're starting a new business in the US, you will want to submit a strong business plan with the application, kind of outlining your financial projections and strong hiring projections for the business. As we said, the hiring projections should show that you plan to hire at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. we already discussed this. So, like if you're able to hire US employees before you apply, that's definitely going to be helpful for your application. And as we said, a CPA letter concluding that the investment is substantial could also be helpful. So what are some typical E-2 visa expenditures? So let's just run through this. So, any money you kind of pay for website setup, hosting, that could be included as part of your investment. Any kind of equipment you purchase. So this could be like computer equipment, like laptop, desktop, printers, scanners, tablets, all of that could be included. Inventory, if you'll be kind of selling products, then any kind of inventory you purchase could be included. Furniture, so this would be furniture, like if you're renting an office and the office doesn't have furniture, so like any furniture you purchase, like a desk, chair, things like that could be included. Then trademark, intellectual property, that could be included as part of the investment. Any money, let's say that you hire employees or contractors before you file the E-2 application. So like any money you pay to the employees or contractors could be included as part of the investment. Legal fees, so this could be legal fees for the entity setup or immigration lawyer legal fees. Then any money you pay for the office lease. So here, let's say that you prepay for like 6 or 12 months, all of that could be included. So like any money you prepay, you can include. And sometimes, if the investment amount is on the lower side, it may be helpful to do this just to kind of increase the investment amount. Like any money you pay for software, subscriptions, things like that can be including. And then any money you pay for like advertising, marketing, and office supplies can be included as well. Perfect. And then what are some weak expenditures or like expenditures we generally don't recommend including? So we generally don't recommend to include flights. Let's say that you come to the US as a B1 business visitor to kind of set up the entity, make the E-2 investment. So, and you want to kind of include the flights from your home country to the US. Generally, like those would be considered weak expenditures, and we generally wouldn't recommend including them. Then let's say that you want to purchase like a car for a business. Here, we generally only recommend including kind of like the car expenditure only if the car is kind of necessary to, like to provide like the services of the business. So like, let's say, for example, that you are starting a law firm and you purchase a car and then you want to include car as part of your investment because you need the car to kind of commute, to your office and meet with clients. In that case, it would be very kind of weak expenditure and we wouldn't recommend including it. Now, let's say that you are starting like a construction company and you are purchasing a truck because your employees will have to kind of transport equipment and kind of go to the sites. So like in that case, the car, would be kind of a strong expenditure and would be included. So it's just kind of going to depend on the type of the business. Then any kind of travel accommodations like hotels, Airbnbs, those would be considered weak and we generally wouldn't include them. Same with like, meals and transportation expenditures, those would not be included. Also, like let's say that you pay for like entertainment, like you come to the US and take your client for, like a lunch or like a hockey game, again, those would be all kind of weak expenditures. And then also, expenses you pay to related parties, those would be considered weak E-2 expenditures as well and generally wouldn't be included. Perfect. So now I will turn it over to Kelly and she will go over some challenges and tips associated with consulting businesses.
Thank you, Michaela. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some things that come up commonly with consulting businesses. So, one issue is that theoretically you need very little investment or almost nothing to actually start up a consulting business. So we do have many clients that come to us and say, I want to get the E-2 visa, but I really have nothing I could spend money on. I have a laptop, I have my network of connections, I don't need anything else. So even though hypothetically that's true, and for as an entrepreneur, you may be thinking you want to spend as little as possible. In order to get the E-2 visa, you do have to put some money at risk, enough to convince the officer that you are actually going to follow through on the business that you're representing to them. So that means that even though, as a business person, maybe you would choose not to spend the money in order to get the E-2 visa, you do have to think about strategically, what could I spend money on that would not be a waste, but is going to get me where I need to go to be able to get this visa and, and actually run the company. So you want to think about things that maybe you would spend money on during the first 1 to 2 years of operations and just maybe move those expenses earlier. So things like office space, sometimes you can prepay for a certain amount, so 6 months or 12 months, and that's really going to help your investment amount. Also equipment. So maybe you buy yourself a new laptop earlier than planned, or if you're planning to hire 2 to 3 people in the first 2 years of operations, maybe you buy their equipment now instead of waiting until you hire them. You could also invest in marketing. This is always a strong E2 expense. So maybe you would be fine with a bare bones website or maybe even no website. But you actually choose to have a website or have a more, advanced website that's going to cost more money because this helps, with the E2 expenditures. You also could hire an employee. Sometimes if people are not able to come to the United States, it can be helpful for them to have maybe an office manager or a part-time administrative assistant who's on the ground doing some of these setup activities for them. And anything you pay for that employee can be included as part of your E2 expenditures. And any ancillary expenses like setting up a payroll provider or getting insurance, all of those things are strong E2 expenditures. Um, you also, because you may have a lower investment amount, just because consulting companies don't normally require a large investment, you can get some market research articles, or articles from business magazines that, point out what the normal startup costs are for this type of business to show that objectively you have spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. Um, it's always a good idea to spend over a large number of categories. So it's generally not successful, maybe to spend, for example, um, you know, $100 at Staples and then, $35,000 on an office space and $10,000 on a website, and that's it. Again, you want to think holistically about how you can explain to the officer that you've spent money in all the normal categories you would normally need to spend in to get a business up and running. Consulting businesses can also face scrutiny from officers who believe that the person is coming into the US to operate as a solo consultant. So this is something you want to keep in mind. This is where hiring an employee can be good on multiple levels. One, because if you do hire someone and you pay them, all that money can be counted as part of your E2 investment. And the other is that it kind of already proactively answers the concern the officer may have that you're going to come in and actually not hire anybody in the United States, which would not work for the E2 marginality requirement. All right, let's talk about investments related to real estate companies. So, anytime you're going to get an E2 and your company is related to real estate, the officer is likely to scrutinize it more closely. Real estate investments can sometimes have challenges because officers are sensitive to the idea of someone just owning property and then collecting rental income from that property, because this is considered a passive activity and is not going to qualify for an E2. This is such a common issue that there are even some consulates that have in their FAQ section a question that says, can I just purchase a property and put it in the name of an LLC and get an E2? And they specifically say no. So this is something they see a lot, and you want to be sensitive to that when preparing an E2 application that's related to real estate. So the challenge here is you want to show this is a real and operating company. There's actually, some kind of good or product or service being provided. And we're receiving, funds. We're going to have enough activity to actually hire workers in the United States. So some ideas that we've listed here, these are things that our clients have done successfully in the past. So things like a real estate brokerage firm, a real estate property management company. Although generally, if you're going to be managing your own properties, you also want to be managing other people's properties. So it's best to have kind of a portfolio. That includes not just your own properties. Renovation and construction businesses are also, can work, and house flipping potentially, but only if it's on a very large scale. So to give you an idea, we had a client who had, a portfolio of about 30 to 40 homes, that they were flipping. So kind of flipping one home or two homes, generally that is not going to be active enough to qualify for the E-2. You can consider something like having a property management company, and then maybe house flipping is another service that you offer as another part of the company. But that's what you want to consider when you're looking at these things. And you also want to be thinking about licensing in the states that you're in. So for many real estate types of businesses, like if you're doing a brokerage, if you're doing some type of construction, you may need licenses. You may need kind of a general contractor's license, or you may need a broker's, license. So you do want to kind of investigate the licensing requirements in the state that you want to set up in and see, is this something you'll be able to get before you apply? If not, can you partner with another business or an individual on the ground in the US who already has this license, who perhaps could enable your business to operate until you're able to get that license. So you do have to plan for that because they will ask about it. Particularly if you're doing a change of status with US Citizenship and Immigration Services, they're very sensitive to this licensing issue. All right. Another area that can be considered high risk for E-2 company ideas is an equity trading company. Has a lot of similar concerns to real estate in the sense that there's some concern that someone is just going to be doing day trading or kind of personal investing, perhaps for themselves and their family, and this is not going to be active enough to qualify, for an E-2 visa. So generally, your clients, you want them to go beyond just friends and family, and demonstrate there's actually going to be enough activity here. The government is convinced it's an active business that will be able to hire employees in the U.S. So similar to real estate, it's a highly regulated industry. You may need to have some licenses. So this is something you should always investigate, and have a plan for and explain, before you go to your E-2 interview. And you have to convince the officer that the business is not kind of just you passively or, trading or personally investing your own funds. All right, let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. So one is low investment amount. So I know we've talked a little bit today about how to mitigate some of the issues with low investment amount. One thing you want to consider is having all the other parts of the case being as strong as possible. That being said, sometimes there's investments that are just too low. For example, we had a client who came to us, they had applied with $2,000 spent and $98,000 in a business bank account. And the officer said, come back when you have invested more. So some amounts are just, even if arguably you could start up a business with $500, it's just not going to be enough to convince the officer that you have put a substantial amount of funds, at risk and irrevocably committed them to the business to show that you will develop and direct this business. So, low investment amount. The good news is that if you do have a lot of working capital, you can kind of invest more and then go back and reapply. So in this example I gave, this client came to us, they had applied on their own. After they were denied, they came to us and we advised them about spending closer to 50,000, and ultimately they were approved. Nature of the business can be another reason for an E-2 denial. So as we've just discussed, there are certain businesses that kind of will flag, be more of a red flag for the officer, things like consulting businesses, real estate, equity trading companies. If you do have one of those types of businesses, you just want to be, aware of the risks and prepared to answer questions related to those risks. Filing location or venue, very, very important for the E-2. There are some consulates that are very used to seeing huge amounts, where E-2s are primarily processed for very large, maybe, multinational companies that are investing hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and sending over lots of employees. For those types of consulates, when they're seeing a small business owner come in with 50,000 spent or, 60,000 invested, they may be harsher on those types of applications. So you do want to think strategically with your lawyer, where can you apply? What are your options? What do you know about that consulate? Additionally, because consular officer assignments change over the years, you sometimes one consulate that might be very friendly suddenly becomes less friendly. So you do need to kind of track those trends, and kind of see, where is a good place to apply depending on, what you're able to invest. The next two are, kind of related. So they both speak to the issue of will you hire workers in the United States? So if you've had a very similar business in your home country and you've never hired employees, let's say you ran a consulting firm as a solo for 10 years and now you're coming to the US to be a consultant, you may want to consider hiring someone before you apply because based on your history, and they will see the work history, on your application, they may say, well, why should we believe that you're actually going to follow this business plan and hire people when for the last 10 years you were in a similar business and you didn't hire anyone? So that is a big concern. You always really need to show that you will be able to create jobs for U.S. workers to, meet that marginality requirement for the E-2. Another reason could be, issues with the adjudicating officer. So, consular officers are human beings. They have good days and bad days. Some of them have different views about what qualifies and what doesn't. So, if you felt that you got a very, unreasonable officer, one who wasn't listening to you, you can always try to reapply. That being said, officers do generally want to see some type of change circumstance. So you do need to be prepared to argue for kind of what is different or better about the case, or if you feel they just really made an error in law, you can try to, explain, in the resubmission, what you think they got wrong. And obviously document anything that happened as well. And usually when you reapply, they will try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but they generally will try. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file on their own or they file, perhaps with an attorney who's not as aware of the requirements. Maybe they, got a loan and the loan is secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So nothing has actually been invested and put at risk. So if you just didn't meet any of the requirements or some of the requirements when you filed, obviously you could, revisit the application, try to get it, in compliance with the rules and then resubmit. All right, let's talk about some adjudication trends. So the government does generally post approval rates. Posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. So many, E-2 visa applications are approved. Our approval rate is around, in the high 90s, although past results do not predict future outcome. We cannot and no attorney can ever guarantee that you will get a visa approval. Let's talk about some timelines. So, right now in London, once you submit your application, they're taking about 60 working days to call you for an interview. That's what's publicly listed. We're seeing sometimes it's taking a bit longer, sometimes kind of 60 or even up to 80, working days before they'll call you for an interview. Once you get called for an interview, usually you can schedule an appointment within a month or two, sometimes less. With Toronto, they are reviewing cases in about 15 to 20 business days. And then once you, are able to schedule your appointment, usually you're able to schedule somewhere between, 3 to 6 weeks. So they are quite a fast consulate compared to others. Generally, consulates are kind of all over the place with timing. So this, we're finally in the stage where consulates are not as impacted by the pandemic. Many of them are kind of back to normal for visa processing. For E2s, some of them are still quite delayed because it took them a while to get back to processing E's, post pandemic. They were focusing on other simpler visa types, and E's kind of went on the back burner. So if there was a long backlog in some consulates, there's still kind of quite a long wait. So it's always good to check with your attorney, depending on where you want to apply, because you can't, just some consulates won't accept you if you're not resident there. So that is something you want to, discuss in advance to understand the timing because it varies wildly between consulates from, a few weeks to a few months to even up to or over a year. All right, let's talk about USCIS versus a consulate filing. So when you're applying for an E-2, you have two options. If you're in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change status, you can apply for a change of status to E-2 with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. If you are outside the US or you want to get a visa stamp, you would apply for the E-2 visa at a consulate. For USCIS filings, the benefit is that they will accept lower investment amounts. So that, the other benefit is you don't have to attend an interview. You can just get approved on the papers. The downside is that you will always only get a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the US, but does not allow you to travel internationally. So that's kind of one big downside. If you're someone who has to travel internationally a lot, a change of status will not be a good option for you. Um, Additionally, they are very, very strict about the source and trail of funds. So even though they'll accept lower investment amounts, for example, even as low as maybe, $35,000, $40,000 for the right type of business, you have to document every dollar that is included in the investment. So whereas at a consulate, they might take a high level view of the source of funds requirement and say, we'll look at your personal tax returns and the proof of the transfer to the US business bank account. If you're using personal savings with USCIS, they would want to see those tax returns, proof of your payroll hitting your bank account, proof of it being maintained there. If it's transferred anywhere, like to savings accounts or investment accounts, you would have to track the flow of that money. So it can get quite complex. So if you're somebody who has a complex source of funds or you've moved money around to a lot of different accounts, a change of status may not be a good option for you versus at a consulate. So, the downside, I suppose, of a consulate is you do have to attend an interview. Many consulates will require higher investment amounts than U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That being said, if you do get approved at a consulate, a major benefit is you can get a visa stamp in your passport, and for many countries, that means a multi-year visa that allows you to travel in and out of the U.S. And each time you enter, you'll get 2 years in E-2 status, but you can keep using that same visa. So, for example, for Canadian nationals or UK nationals, you can get this 5-year visa and renew it indefinitely in increments of 5 years. Talking about some post-specific considerations. As I described earlier about the timelines, posts, and the way they adjudicate the visas will kind of vary, widely. So different posts have different ways they want the application submitted, a different order, different page limits. You always need to look at the consular instructions to see exactly how they want it. More and more consulates are being very picky, and if you do not upload it in a certain way, they will just send the application back. You also want to be aware of consular preferences. So as I was discussing earlier, certain consulates are very used to seeing, very large companies that are investing a lot more money. You want to keep that in mind when you're deciding where to apply. Another trend with consulates is many of them for a business plan for a startup, they're now asking that there be a CPA certification included. So this is something where, they want a CPA to have looked at and verified, the financials for the business plan. So this is something to keep in mind as well, when you're preparing your E-2 application. All right, so let's talk about some issues and complex areas that have come up for the E-2. One question we receive a lot, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E-2 visa? And the answer is no. It's not required in the regulations that you hire anybody before you apply for the E-2 visa. That being said, as we've discussed earlier in the presentation, there can be large benefits to hiring an employee before you file. So although it's not required, it is something that can be very beneficial. It's also something that, unfortunately, for officers that are not as well versed in the E-2, it's something they get confused about sometimes, and ask to verify. So there can be some benefits. Although it's not required in the law, it's always helpful to have employees. Complicated source and trail of funds for USCIS filings. So this is something that, it can be quite complex if you're doing a filing with USCIS and you have multiple bank statements or multiple sources of funds. Loans are permitted as the source of funds for an E-2, but the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So something like seller financing in a purchase scenario is really not going to work for the E-2 because it's secured by the assets of the business. Gifts can be used for the E-2, but you have to make sure the gift giver is willing to provide all the financial documentation that's necessary to prove that the funds came from a legitimate source. So let's say your mother is giving you a gift because she sold a property. The gift letter on its own is not going to be enough. They're also going to want to see the purchase sale agreement for the property, proof of your mother receiving the money, proof of your mother transferring the money to you. Um, E-2 visas for two investors. So people often ask if this is possible. It is, but the ownership has to be 50-50 if you want to do two investors. If both partners are of the same nationality, then you could potentially do an investor and an employee, if the 50-50 split would not work. Substantive changes to the E-2 after filing. This does come up a lot. Sometimes people feel that because they got a 5-year visa, that is a work visa, it means they can work anywhere, or the business can change, or they can do anything. And this is not the case. Any changes in ownership that maybe would drop the E-2 investor under 50% could be problematic. Could mean that their visa is really no longer valid because the business is not meeting the E-2 requirements anymore. Changes in the type of business. So let's say you made an investment and you submitted an application for a French restaurant, and now you're going to close that French restaurant and start a wedding photography business. So you cannot do this without first going and getting an approval either from USCIS or from the consulate. When you submitted your application to the consulate, they approved you to run the type of business that you had, um, you know, represented to them. So if you want to make a major substantial change to that business, you need to get an approval first. However, if it's not really a substantial change, if maybe you're just adding a new service line, that's related to the business you were doing, or this is something you contemplated in your original business plan, then you would not need to get an approval. But that's why it's good to plan in the beginning. Let's say you want to provide some type of, IT consulting service, but you're also working on mobile app development. You can contemplate the mobile app development in your business plan. So if that ultimately becomes the major part of the business, you're not having to go back, and submit a new application to get an approval for that change. Family business purchases, this is something that you're going to have more scrutiny on on this type of case. You may get more questions as to whether the business was valued, by, someone who's objective. So maybe you get a CPA or a company that will do a valuation of the business, and whatever you spend, should make sense in light of what the financials of the business are showing. So if the financials show the business is, very lucrative, very successful, and the investment amount is very low, they're going to look at that and they're going to question you more. Um, let's talk about, the impact of the new administration. Lots of questions around this. So Buy American, Hire American, this is something we saw the last time. And this is something that the focus as you're preparing your E-2 case should be on spending money in the United States, hiring US workers, anything you can do to indicate that through this application and through this business, you are benefiting the US, in an economic sense, that is going to be beneficial, for your case. Additionally, we will likely start to see, just stricter adjudications. So that means that higher investments, higher employee numbers, these will all be beneficial, for these types of cases, cases that perhaps were borderline but got through, may have a more difficult time in this administration, which is less friendly, towards immigration. You want to think about much more spending the money in the United States. So it's not a requirement that you spend the money in the US. You can invest the money, anywhere, but it's going to be better for your case if you can show that, the money has been spent in the US. So let's say you need to, buy a computer, and you have the option to buy it, in Canada or in the United States, you should buy it in the United States. That being said, approval rates did not change much, from 2016 to 2020. But something else you want to keep in mind is just that, staffing issues at the Department of State can potentially start to create, bottlenecks in visa appointment availability. So it is a good idea, to try to apply earlier, and have that kind of longer runway in mind. All right, so let's see if any questions have come in. I see a couple here. One, can I open a new LLC and invest in existing LLC running a business for 50% stake? I'm not sure what this question is asking, but basically, if you, yeah, I'm not really sure what this question is asking. You can open an LLC and invest, and run that. If you are talking about opening an LLC and then investing through to run a business through a chain of ownership, what I'll say is you want whatever the E-2 entity is the one that should be active, hiring employees, taking in revenue. So if the new LLC is just a holding company, that's not going to work for the E-2. Someone's asking about our legal fees. So what I'd say is, please feel free to reach out to us through email, and we're happy to send all the information about that, through email. All right. It looks like no further questions have come in, so we'll close here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michaela, for sharing your knowledge. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah.